The evening began like any other, ordinary, unremarkable, the kind of day you expect to slip quietly into memory. I was sitting in the corner of a small café I often used as an escape, nursing a cup of coffee that had long since cooled. The low hum of conversation, the faint clinking of porcelain, and the mellow strum of an acoustic guitar playing softly through the speakers created a cocoon of calm. I didn't know it then, but she was about to step into that space and alter it completely. She walked in with a quiet kind of confidence, the sort of presence that doesn't announce itself with noise, but with gravity. Every movement she made seemed deliberate yet unforced, from the way she adjusted the strap of her bag to the subtle sweep of her hair as she glanced around the room. She couldn't have been more than a few years older than my mother, and yet there was a grace to her that drew the eye before you even realized you were staring. I caught myself doing exactly that, staring, and when her gaze flicked in my direction, I looked away too quickly, suddenly self-conscious. But in that brief moment, I saw something, curiosity, maybe, or the faintest trace of amusement. It was enough to set my heartbeat racing, though I couldn't explain why. She chose the table across from mine, diagonally placed so that we weren't facing each other directly, yet close enough that I could feel her presence like a gentle pull. She set down a worn leather notebook before ordering tea, her fingers brushing the pages as if they held something precious. That small gesture fascinated me. There's something intimate about watching someone handle the objects they treasure, like you're glimpsing a part of their inner world without permission. I tried to return to my own notes, but my attention kept drifting back. Every so often, I would sense her glancing up too, and our eyes would meet for just a second longer than politeness required. Those moments carried a strange weight, as if words were forming in the silence between us, though neither of us dared to speak them. The air seemed to grow denser, not uncomfortable, but charged in a way that made me keenly aware of every sound, every shift in the room. The scrape of her chair against the floor, the delicate stir of her spoon in the cup, the way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. Each detail lodged itself in my memory with unusual clarity. And then, perhaps because silence felt too fragile to keep intact forever, she offered the simplest of openings. Her voice was warm, low, carrying a softness that contrasted with her poise. She asked if I came here often, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. I remember fumbling for an answer, trying to sound casual even as a nervous energy crackled beneath my skin. It wasn't much, just a question, a smile, the start of something neither of us had named yet. But even then, I felt the quiet certainty that this was no ordinary encounter. The cafe had grown quieter as the evening pressed on, the once busy chatter thinning until only a handful of us remained. The soft glow of the hanging lamps threw gentle pools of amber light across the tables, and I noticed how it caught the edges of her profile. The curve of her cheek, the calmness in her expression, the faint, thoughtful crease between her brows as she studied the notes in her journal. When she spoke again, her tone carried that same warmth I'd noticed before, but now with a touch of curiosity. She asked what I was working on, gesturing with a small tilt of her chin toward my open notebook. For a moment, I hesitated. It wasn't that my notes were private, but there was something vulnerable about being seen through them. Still, her gaze wasn't prying. It was patient, expectant, almost kind. So I told her, just fragments of ideas, half-formed thoughts I scribbled down to make sense of the day. She listened, not with the distracted politeness most people give, but with a stillness that made me feel my words mattered. Her eyes didn't wander. Her posture leaned slightly forward, and when I stumbled to explain myself, she smiled in a way that eased my nerves. In return, she spoke of her own writing. Nothing too detailed, but enough to let me glimpse the quiet weight of her experience. The way she described life was different from how I saw it. Less hurried, more deliberate, like she'd learned to notice the subtleties that others often missed. She spoke of fleeting moments, the sound of rain on windows at night, the pause before answering a difficult question, the way silence sometimes carried more truth than words. I found myself captivated, not just by what she said, but how she said it. Her voice had a steadiness to it, but beneath that, a softness, almost as if she was revealing pieces of herself carefully, testing whether they were safe in my presence. At one point, her hand brushed the edge of my notebook as she leaned closer to point out something I'd written. It was a light touch, accidental, probably, but sent a ripple through me. The brush of her fingers against the paper, so near my own, felt strangely intimate. I caught my breath before she drew her hand back, and for a second, our eyes locked again. Something unspoken lingered there, something both of us seemed to sense, but neither dared name. Outside, the sky had shifted into twilight, streaks of indigo and faint gold stretching across the windows. She glanced toward it, then back at me, and there was a pause, long enough that I wondered if she might stand, gather her things, and leave. Instead, she rested her chin lightly in her palm and asked me a question I wasn't expecting. Do you ever feel like you're searching for something, but you're not sure what it is? The words hung between us, tender and a little raw. And as I sat there, heart quickening, I realized this was more than casual conversation. She was offering me a glimpse into her vulnerability, a quiet bridge between her world and mine. In that moment, the cafe seemed to shrink until it was just the two of us, our voices threading softly through the air, building a connection neither of us had planned, but both seemed unwilling to let slip away. The cafe had grown quieter as the evening pressed on, the once busy chatter thinning until only a few of us remained. The low hum of background music seemed softer now, blending with the occasional clink of cutlery. The hanging lamps cast a warm amber glow across the tables, painting everything in softer edges. It was in that light that I noticed how her profile seemed both strong and gentle at once. The curve of her cheek, the subtle crease of thought between her brows, the way her lips curved when she was lost in whatever she was writing. She was the one who bridged the silence. Her voice carried easily but softly when she asked what I was working on. There was no pressure in her tone, only genuine interest. For a heartbeat, I froze, suddenly protective of the scribbled thoughts in my notebook. They weren't polished, just fragments of ideas, unfinished sketches of the day. But the look in her eyes was patient and kind, almost encouraging. So I opened up, explaining in halting words what I wrote about, snippets of observations, little reflections I didn't want to lose. She listened differently than most people. Her eyes didn't wander, her expression didn't turn vacant. Instead, she leaned in ever so slightly, as if each word mattered more than I realized. When I stumbled to explain myself, she gave me a small, reassuring smile that steadied me more than I expected. Then she told me about her own writing. Not everything, just enough for me to glimpse a window in her world. She spoke about slowing down, about paying attention to the silences that carry truths we often overlook. She described the beauty of things most people rush past, the stillness of rain on glass, the moment someone pauses before answering a hard question, the quiet comfort of knowing you're not alone, even when no words are spoken. The way she described life pulled me in. Her voice was steady, but there was softness beneath it, almost like she was carefully offering pieces of herself, testing whether I would treat them gently. At one point, she reached to point out something in my notes, her fingertips brushing the edge of the page near my hand. The touch was light, probably accidental, but it sent a ripple through me. I felt the heat rise in my chest, and before I could recover, our eyes met again. It was only a second, but it carried something unspoken, something fragile yet undeniable. Twilight gathered outside the windows, painting the glass in deep blues and golds. She glanced at it, then back at me, resting her chin in her hand. Her next question came almost quietly. Do you ever feel like you're searching for something, but you don't know what it is? The words landed gently but deeply, as though she hadn't meant them to be rhetorical. And for a long moment, I couldn't answer, because sitting across from her, with the warmth of her presence filling the space between us, I wondered if maybe I'd already found it. When she finally closed her notebook, the cafe was nearly empty. The staff were wiping down counters, stacking chairs, dimming lights. A part of me dreaded the moment, because endings always carry a certain finality, but instead of saying goodbye, she surprised me. With a small smile, she asked if I'd like to walk with her a little. I agreed before I could think too hard about it. Outside, the evening air wrapped around us, cool, faintly sweet with the scent of nearby jasmine, the streets glistening from a light rain that must have passed while we were talking. The world felt quieter than usual, as if it had decided to give us space. We walked side by side without hurry. Her pace was measured, unhurried, and it steadied mine. Our shoulders weren't touching, but they were close enough that I felt a strange awareness of the distance, like a thread stretched between us, fragile but impossible to ignore. She spoke about her favorite streets, the way the lamps cast golden pools on the pavement, the little bakery that opened before dawn, the park bench where she often sat when she needed to think. I listened, drawn in not by the details themselves, but by the way she gave them meaning. She had a way of turning the ordinary into something worth noticing. At one point, she asked about my family, my work, the things that shaped me. I answered as best I could, but I caught myself leaving out the rehearsed answers I usually gave strangers. With her, it felt different, like I didn't have to prove anything. Her presence had that effect, an ease that drew out honesty. The rain had left small puddles shimmering under the streetlights. She paused at one, her reflection wavering in the water, and for a moment I saw her differently, not just composed and confident, but faintly vulnerable, softened by the night. She glanced at me, almost as if to check if I noticed, and I did. But I said nothing, letting the silence carry the weight of the moment. Then it happened, small, almost inconsequential, but it stayed with me. As we crossed a narrow street, she reached lightly for my arm, her fingers resting against my sleeve as we stepped off the curb together. The touch was brief, practical even, but it left a warmth that spread through me. When she let go, the absence was sharper than it should have been. We walked on, our conversation drifting into softer tones. She told me about moments when she had felt out of place in her own life, the quiet doubts she rarely admitted aloud. I listened, and when I finally offered something of my own, a confession of uncertainty about where I was heading, she didn't dismiss it or try to fix it. She simply nodded, as though my hesitation had a place beside hers. By the time we circled back near the café, the night had deepened, and the world around us seemed hushed. We stood there for a moment, neither of us moving, neither eager to let the evening end. Her smile was small but sincere when she finally said, "Maybe next time, you'll show me what you've written." I nodded, unable to hide the quiet stir of anticipation in my chest. The night felt heavier when she walked away, but it carried with it something fragile, something alive, a beginning that neither of us had planned, yet both of us seemed to want. The days that followed moved with unusual weight, as though each one carried the echo of that night. I found myself returning to the café more often, always with the quiet hope of seeing her again. Sometimes she was there, already seated with her notebook, her expression calm but thoughtful. Other times I arrived first, and the anticipation of her arrival filled me with a restless energy I couldn't quite explain. When we spoke, it felt natural, easy, even, but beneath that ease ran an undercurrent I was becoming more aware of. There was a closeness forming between us, something fragile but undeniable, and it left me torn. Part of me wanted to lean into it, to see where it could go. Another part whispered caution. One evening, we found ourselves at the same corner table, our notebooks open but forgotten. She had been telling me about a time years ago when she'd felt lost, unsure of what direction to take. Her honesty caught me off guard, not because of the story itself, but because of the way she told it, with no pretense, no shield. I remember watching the way her hands moved as she spoke. She rested her fingertips lightly against her cup, tracing the rim absent-mindedly, her voice steady but touched with a softness that made me ache. I wanted to reach across, to cover her hand with mine, to let her know that her words mattered more than she realized. But I didn't. The space between us was charged, and breaking it felt dangerous. At some point, our conversation drifted into silence. Not an uncomfortable one, but heavy, filled with things unsaid. I could feel her eyes on me, And when I looked up, the moment stretched too long, too deep, carrying with it a quiet recognition of what was happening between us. That was when she shifted slightly, drawing back with a faint smile. It wasn't rejection exactly, but it was a reminder, a line neither of us had crossed. She reached for her notebook, flipping it open as if to anchor herself. Her composure was intact, but I sensed it, the hesitation, the awareness of how easily this could blur into something neither of us had prepared for. The rest of the evening carried that unspoken tension. Even when she leaned closer to show me something she'd written, I noticed how careful she was, how her hand hovered near mine without touching. Even when she laughed, it had a softness edged with restraint. When she finally stood to leave, she lingered just a moment too long by the table, as if deciding whether to say something more. In the end, all she gave me was a smile that held warmth but also distance. Then she slipped her notebook in her bag and walked out into the night. I sat there long after, my coffee cold, my notes untouched, replaying the way her eyes had softened and then shifted away. I understood then, whatever this was, it wasn't simple. It carried the weight of boundaries, of questions neither of us had yet dared to voice. And it was in that tension between closeness and restraint that the pull between us grew even stronger. The next time we met, the cafe was alive with its usual rhythm, voices overlapping, the hiss of the espresso machine, the soft shuffle of people coming and going. Yet none of it seemed to touch the quiet space that formed between us once we began talking. It had become a pattern. No matter how crowded the room, it always felt like we were sitting in our own pocket of stillness. That evening, she seemed different, not distant, but more thoughtful, as though something weighed on her. I noticed the way she paused before answering simple questions, how her fingers lingered against her teacup without lifting it. When I asked if she was all right, she gave a small smile, the kind that didn't quite reach her eyes. Instead of pressing, I shared something of my own. I told her about the uncertainty I often carried, how it sometimes felt like I was waiting for my life to begin, even though it already had. My words felt clumsy at first, but once spoken, they seemed to open something between us. She looked at me, then really looked, and in her eyes I saw recognition. "You remind me," she said softly, "of a part of myself I thought I'd outgrown." The words lingered in the air, heavier than I expected. Her voice was steady, but the way her gaze dropped to the table told me she was holding back more than she revealed. I wanted to reach for her hand, to bridge that fragile distance, but the weight of what it might mean kept me still. Instead, our conversation shifted into something quieter, almost confessional. She spoke of choices she had made, paths she hadn't taken, and the way time shapes us in ways we don't always notice. Her words carried both strength and vulnerability, and I found myself listening not just to her stories, but to the silences between them. At one point, she laughed softly at something I said, a genuine sound that lit her face in a way that made my chest ache. And then, without meaning to, I let my guard slip. My hand brushed against hers as I reached for my notebook. It was accidental, quick, but unlike before, neither of us pulled away immediately. Her hand remained still under mine, warm and steady, and for a breathless moment the entire world seemed to narrow to that single point of contact. She looked up, our eyes meeting across the fragile connection of our hands. It wasn't dramatic, not the stuff of films or novels, but it was real, raw, and charged with everything we hadn't said aloud. I could feel my pulse against my wrist, and I wondered if she could sense it too. Then, just as quickly, she withdrew, gently, not abruptly, but enough to remind us both of the boundary neither had yet chosen to cross. She tucked her hair behind her ear, offering me a smile that carried both warmth and caution. We continued talking as if nothing had happened, but the air had changed. Every word, every glance, every pause between us now hummed with something unspoken. We were both aware of it, the nearness of confession, the closeness of something neither of us dared name. When she left that evening, the imprint of her hand still lingered on mine, a reminder of how close we had come to breaking the silence completely. The evening unfolded differently than the others. The cafe was closed by the time we met. She had asked if I would walk with her again, and I agreed without hesitation. The streets were quieter than before, the lamps glowing softly against the damp pavement. A breeze stirred through the trees, carrying the faint scent of earth and rain. At first, we spoke lightly, about books, about places we hoped to visit someday. But beneath every word, there was something heavier pressing closer. I could feel it in the way her eyes lingered a moment too long, in the way her laughter seemed edged with something unsaid. Eventually, we found ourselves in the park, sitting on a bench beneath a canopy of branches. The world felt hushed, as though the night itself was holding its breath. She rested her notebook beside her, folded her hands in her lap, and for a long time, neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of all the glances, all the touches, all the things we had held back. I wanted to tell her everything. How I thought of her even when she wasn't there, how the sound of her voice stayed with me, how her presence had shifted something inside me that I couldn't undo. But the words stuck, too fragile, too heavy to release. And then she looked at me, not the casual glances we had shared before, but a steady, searching gaze. Her eyes softened, and I could see the hesitation in them, the quiet fear and longing intertwined. "You know, this isn't simple," she said, her voice low, almost a whisper. I nodded, my throat tight. "I know." Her hand lifted slightly, then fell back to her lap as though caught between impulse and restraint. For a moment, I thought she might end it there, close the door gently, and walk away. But instead, she exhaled, a slow release of breath, and finally let her fingers graze against mine where they rested on the bench. It wasn't a full touch, not yet, but it was enough to unravel me. My chest tightened, every nerve alive with the weight of that small connection. Slowly, carefully, I turned my hand, letting my fingers thread lightly with hers. She didn't pull away this time. Her grip wasn't firm, but it was steady, her warmth seeping into my skin. The silence deepened. I could hear the rhythm of her breathing, the faint rustle of leaves above us. She leaned slightly closer, her shoulder brushing mine, and in that closeness, everything unspoken seemed to surface all at once. "This feels dangerous," she murmured, but the way her hand tightened against mine betrayed her words. "Maybe," I answered softly, "but it also feels like the truth." Her eyes glistened faintly in the lamplight, and for a heartbeat, I thought she might kiss me. Instead, she rested her head gently against my shoulder, her hair brushing my cheek. The contact was tender, grounding, more intimate than any kiss could have been. I closed my eyes, letting the weight of her against me sink deep, anchoring me in a moment that felt both fragile and infinite. For the first time, the silence between us didn't ache. It felt like home. The morning after our walk, I woke with the memory of her head resting against my shoulders still vivid, like a warmth that lingered long after the fire had faded. I wondered if it had been real, or if my mind had magnified it into something larger than it was. But when I stepped back into the cafe a few days later and saw her there, waiting with that familiar calm presence, I knew it hadn't been a dream. She looked up as I approached, her eyes softening in recognition. There was no awkwardness, no need to explain. Whatever had passed between us in the park, it had changed something, but instead of making the air heavier, it made it lighter. We spoke as we always did, but with a new ease. The silences felt different now, less charged with uncertainty, more comfortable, like shared ground we both trusted. I noticed the way she let her hand rest openly on the table near mine, no longer pulling away if our fingers brushed. Each small contact, her hand grazing my wrist as she reached for her cup, her shoulder brushing mine when she leaned close to show me something she'd written, felt unforced, natural, as if we had quietly given each other permission. At one point, she closed her notebook and looked at me with a quiet seriousness. "I don't know where this is going," she said. Her voice was steady, but her eyes carried a vulnerability she rarely showed. "I only know that I don't want to pretend it isn't there." I felt my chest tighten, not with fear, but with something closer to relief. "Neither do I," I admitted. Her smile then was small but real, carrying both courage and hesitation. She reached across the table, her fingertips brushing mine before resting there fully. I turned my hand upward, letting her settle into the space that had been waiting for her all along. For a long while, we didn't need words. The cafe around us carried on. People coming and going, cups clinking, the world moving at its usual pace. But for us, time slowed. The connection wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, steady, a thread woven gently but firmly between us. Later, as we left together, the evening sun poured gold across the street. We walked side by side, our arms brushing now and then, until finally she slipped her hand into mine. It was such a simple gesture, yet it felt like the most honest thing either of us had done. There were still questions, of course. Boundaries, differences, the uncertain shape of what lay ahead. But none of that seemed to matter in that moment. What mattered was the way her fingers laced with mine, the way her presence felt like both anchor and discovery. For the first time, I wasn't searching. I wasn't waiting for life to begin. I was already in it, walking beside her, step by quiet step, into whatever came next.